and very, very happy to try to say something, to have got this offer from Shamrat, who is a very dear friend, and Pavel and the Shamiloni Mohammedalalai, who have thought of this really fascinating title for their lecture series. Uh, and I am really happy that something like this is happening, and really happy to make a small contribution to this. So let us, and also I should say that humanities across disciplines, that is a very vital, very absolutely necessary thing to think about in these times. In these times when humanities itself is uh, as we all know, under attacks on various counts. The spirit of humanities, the spirit uh, which distinguishes humanities from certain other kinds of disciplines, that has been under attack severely, intensively, almost throughout the globe. So it's really necessary to think of humanities in its relations to other disciplines, especially in both today's Devashista's talk, and I'll also try to think of it in terms of the relationships of humanities with the sciences in a certain way. And just to be very clear, like after this extremely rich, extremely variegated, nuanced discussion by Devashista, like I would try to think of some very elementary things, uh, uh, almost like uh, starkly simple, and try to make only one or two points that might interest the people who are listening to this discussion. I move on to what I want to talk about. As Patil has already told, like the title today is for me is non-stroke relations, othering in the field of the sciences. Um, I'll try to think of uh, certain structural and logical dynamic in the relationship relationships with uh, which like the sciences try to build their hegemony in the disciplinary fields, uh, and how these relations are in some sense non-relations as well, uh, where as is evident from the title, othering happens in a certain way, and to think beyond the sciences in the domain of knowledge, to think in terms of the humanities in the domain of knowledge, is to think of a dynamic of othering which is different from a dynamic of othering through which the sciences work. That would be the basic point, maybe which I'll try to talk about. Mm, and it will like to put it very simply, the my argument will revolve around like two sets of names, two sets of words. One would be like, to put it uh, very succinctly, very in an elementary way, the uh, the distinctions between uh, as if and perhaps. I take it from one very important essay by Jacques Derrida, uh, the university without condition, where like among again like a number of different things about which there is talking about there. I see like these dynamic working in very insidious ways, and also in sometimes in explicit ways, these distinctions between what one might call as if and what one might call perhaps, uh, as would be evident, uh, like in both of these, there is a certain sense of making up, a certain sense of uh, real, which may not be fully real, uh, like, but in the making up of this not fully reality, not fully real, uh, there is a slight difference, the way in which the notion of as if produces the real and the notion of perhaps engages with the real. There is a slight difference, and within that distinction, I will try to place my argument uh, regarding the distinction between the humanities and the sciences, the relationships between the humanities and the sciences, uh, and the non-relations between the humanities and the sciences. And also two other terms would be important here. Those terms are the notion of the unconditional and the notion of the sovereign. These are also there in that essay by Derrida. But before going into that, before going into these very important and interesting distinctions which mark my argument today. I'll try to talk about two other moments. One again is a very uh, well-known moment in anyone who uh, thinks about science in its relations with the others. Anyone who is like more or less like thinking in terms of disciplines, uh, try to think in terms of disciplines, and which like hundreds of essays maybe and a number of books have been written on this, which is the Sokal affair. Mm. I'll begin with that. Then I'll try to think of one moment of thinking about science in its relation to others, the moment where uh, Weber thinks it in terms of disenchantment, and a certain feminist rereading of that moment. And then I move on to the humanities, science, and the university at the end of the essay. The Sokal affair, as most of us definitely already know, but maybe for the students it might uh, be helpful if we recall the bare lineaments of what happened. It was in 1996, as we all know, Alan Sokal, a physicist, uh, a left-leaning physicist, uh, brought out an essay in a very important journal uh, called important and like one of the leading journals of the time, Social Text. Um, an essay which dealt with, uh, I think it will be interesting to just uh, which dealt with the uh, a sort of what one might
অনির্বাণ দা,
very
অনির্বাণ দা,
বলো
বলছি একটু just can you be a bit louder, because many people are
ও
saying that
আচ্ছা আচ্ছা
the sound is less. একটু জোরে বলো বা একটু কি do something about
আচ্ছা
it. Just আমি একটু interrupt করলাম, sorry.
আচ্ছা আচ্ছা হ্যাঁ কিছু একটা uh, oh is the sound
মানে আমি বুঝতে পারছি না, বাট অডিয়েন্স
uh,
বলছে তুমি যতটা সম্ভব দেখো। হ্যাঁ,
আচ্ছা
হ্যাঁ, সরি।
is it better now এখন এখন কি একটু বেটার
সেটা
হয়েছে
হ্যাঁ, আমি তো ভালোই শুনতে পাচ্ছি, কিন্তু ওইখানে বলছি ইউটিউবে মনে একটু আসছে। হ্যাঁ, হ্যাঁ, ইয়েস বলছি।
আচ্ছা
ঠিক আছে,
এখন একটু বেটার হয়েছে আচ্ছা
বেটার। হার্দিক
uh,
বলছে বেটার, ইয়েস, ওকে।
আচ্ছা fine so like the name of this essay would be like self-explanatory in a way. It was called transgressing the boundaries toward a transformative hermeneutics of quantum gravity. uh, so in a way this would be what one may very loosely call a sort of a postmodern take on the sciences, and which talked about how um, the notion of quantum gravity would be thought of uh, in terms of like the new theoretical mechanisms that were going on in that period. Mm, so this essay was published in Social Text. Just within a few months, Alan Sokal came up with a smaller essay in a different journal, saying that this essay was a hoax. Mm, and this has been initiated. This has initiated the like turbulent debate around the sciences, which has been then known as the affair of the like Sokal hoax. And very interestingly, that issue of social text was itself called the science wars, an issue on the science wars, which seemed to which claimed to deal with the war around the notion of science, which has been uh, uh, like been there for quite some time then, around how to think about science, how to think about the claims to reality and the claims to truth in science. So what Sokal told, came up with in his later essay, that he said that like what he said in that essay was bogus. It was wrong in different ways, but what he had done was he had used the jargon that were operative in the then humanities and social sciences disciplines, to and put them in very cleverly, so that people were hoodwinked into publishing this essay in a quite reputed journal. And for Sokal, it showed the shoddiness of scholarship in the humanities that was re- relevant, that was like operating at the point of time. So it's not a very important event practically, like many people have talked about later on, around notions of what these meant for Sokal's own credibility, what this meant for like and like the journal editors themselves came up with a response to this, where they told that like this article was referred back to the author a number of times, um, but then he persisted with what he said, and finally they came up with in publishing the essay. Uh, there is a huge debate around this. I will really not go into that here today. It's quite well known by now. What I will try to think of is only about one or two things which uh, this might, uh, this whole affair might uh, signify for the difference between the sciences and the humanities, the way in which like quote unquote the scientists would um, think of the whole field of knowledge, and also uh, some points about and I'll not go into those like what the humanities should the necessary thinking and rethinking on the part of the humanities which this should uh, imply. But the point that I want to think about here is very interestingly, and then Sokal also came up with a book along with another scholar, Jean Bricmont, and this book um, was called, like the English translation was called Fashionable Nonsense, uh, Postmodern Intellectuals' Abuse of Science. And it's quite evident like what it tries to say. But very interestingly, what is done there by Sokal is he tries to show how different theoreticians uh, like Deleuze or Irigaray or Kristeva, mm, Derrida to some extent, how they were using terms coming from science, uh, according to Sokal, in order to like use the authority of science to boost their own claims, but not really understanding or going into the very specific meanings in which these words were being used in the sciences. Uh, I'll talk about only two things here. One, let us remember uh, the way in which, say, a scientific journal differs from, say, a journal in the humanities and social sciences in deciding upon which papers to publish. For the sciences, the important point probably would be like whether what the paper says is right or wrong, is correct or incorrect. Uh, for these other disciplines, on the other hand, rather than the question of correctness or incorrectness, what might be important uh, would be the way the argument is built up, the whether certain very interesting points are raised, which may or may not be correct in the scientific sense, and yet thus may call for publication. So uh, this the debate around this thing, maybe not the uh, event itself, but the debate around this event showed the differences between these two ways of thinking about what is good scholarship. So it's not to say that there is nothing called correct or incorrect in the humanities. It's I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that uh, what makes an intervention important is not only the correctness of the facts. So that is one point, which, in a certain way, like so-called mixed, I think, uh, but also the necessity on the part of the humanities scholars to maintain a certain rigor in the in the arguments. That is also like it's something like where both sides loses. It's not that one side wins against the other. Uh, and the other thing which is a little more clear in Sokal's book is the way he thinks of when he thinks of a word, he thinks of the meaning of the word in the context of science, and is almost oblivious uh, in how the same word might be used in different ways in a different context. So, like I often I talk about this. Say the notion of the topos. The notion of the topos in topology, the scientific discipline, the discipline in mathematics, geometry, and the notion of the topos in, say, rhetoric, they're completely different. Uh, one might open oneself up to these differences in enunciation, or one might think one of these meanings to be the correct one and the others to be the wrong ones. So Sokal, I would say, uh, like goes for the latter. He thinks the meaning of the word in the scientific context to be the only possible meaning, while the others are incorrect. But uh, this also is something which is missed often on the part of quote unquote the sciences. So uh, when one thinks of the hegemony of science in the uh, field of disciplines, in the field of knowledge, uh, these are some of the very small, very almost negligible, but very important points through which these hegemony works. I would say. Um, and now, uh, just I'd keep this hanging. I'll come back to this discussion at the end of my talk. And now I'll go into discussion of one moment in the uh, thinking about science, where one tries to think about the relation between science and non-science. So, Sokal affair being one moment where the relation between science and non-science is being thought of in a certain way on the part of the sciences. mm, there will be a mirroring of this on the part of the quote unquote non sciences as well. I didn't talk about those. But now I move on to a very quick discussion uh, the uh, on the problem of locating the break between science and non-science. So science, in a way, has been the defining moment of the secular modern. Uh, one may argue with the centrality thus accorded to science, but no one probably would contest the import of science as one of the central elements of modernity. The break from the sacred often appears as the event of the emergence of science from the structures of prior forms of knowledge. Yet this appearance has its antecedents, and the break also has its continuities. Uh, So, through references to mainly Max Weber, I try to think of how the ruptures and connections are thought of in a very particular way. And I also move into a discussion by Evelyn Fox-Keller in a certain way about this distinction. For Weber, the operative word that distinguishes science from the sacred is disenchantment. Not that disenchantment as an element of civilization in the West was earlier absent. On the contrary, it was there for thousands of years. What happens is now it becomes the central defining element of man's vocation. This is according to Weber. Science as vocation does not imply a focus on its efficacy in practical and technical matters, the attainment of practical technological ends, nor does it imply the use of science to reach true being, art, true nature, true God, or true happiness. These earlier illusions are in a way removed. These are not the vocation of the scientist. The vocation is something like science for science's sake. The interesting point is that science is associated with the idea of progress. The idea of fulfillment is different for art and science. Every achievement in science is to be surpassed within years. So the question, why try to attain something that will inevitably be dated very soon? The preconceptions of science as a vocation, as Weber sees them, belong to two orders. The evident ones are the rules of logic and method operative in the workings of science. The hidden one is the principle that productions of scientific work are worth knowing. But this proposition about science's inherent worth cannot be scientifically established. This needs something akin to what animates the artist, like inspiration. Passion for Weber is the precondition for inspiration. The right thing to occur to the individual cannot be forced, cannot follow only from the calculations. Calculation is a prerequisite of this occurrence, necessary but not sufficient. Again, this inspiration is not derived from any practical ends that science leads to. The scientist lecturer is not a demagogue or a prophet. Disenchantment of the world for Weber is the knowledge or the belief that if one wanted to, one could find out any time that there are, in principle, no mysterious, incalculable powers at work. One could, in principle, master everything through calculation. This, more than anything, is intellectualization as such. Weber discusses the possible claims of theology as science. He calls it the intellectual rationalization of the position of what is sacred. But theology is not only rationalization, it also involves a quote unquote sacrifice of the intellect in the sense of accepting certain propositions to be beyond the reach of knowledge. These are different from the preconceptions of science. Science retains the element of decision in choosing its preconception. For theology, the choice is given, not decided upon. The religions provide a morality, a dignity. This is replaced in the disenchanted world by the dignity of man, by the sense of responsibility of evil. Polytheism of religions is thus replaced by rationalizing of ethical, methodical conduct of life, by the invocation of the calculated conduct of one that is necessary. Science for the main at the threshold of modernity was a way to God, ways to find meanings that lay hidden in God's intentions. Today, science is irreligious, not the way to God. The intellectualist romanticism of the irrational today, Weber says, is to reach out to the sphere of the irrational with reason to make it reasonable. It is interesting to repeat that the passion for science, thus underivable from scientific calculations, is a passion for the disenchantment that science implies. The passion for science is not a rational scientific impulse. The answer to the question why one does science is not a scientific answer. Yet the vocation of science, grounded upon the impulse to do science, has its own rational form. The control of things through calculation and clarity, production of internally meaningful conclusions are parts of this impulse. So this is to like summarize very reductively perhaps what Weber is trying to think about disenchantment in thinking about science. Evelyn Foxkeller deals with the gendering of disenchantment. She approaches the problem through the question of the secret. For Weber, disenchantment had been the belief that one could, in principle, master everything through calculation. Disenchantment is a possibility of the final doing away of the secrets and of incalculability. For Foxkeller, the change in the meaning of secret and the relations to the secret are at the heart of the scientific revolution and the purported progress in science. She goes into the lineages of secrets of God, secrets of nature, secrets of life, and secrets of death. In the enchanted view, secrets belong to God. Secrets are by definition unknown, not for human understanding. Knowledge had potentially been truncated and fearful. In other words, knowledge had been respectful to the unknown, to non knowledge. Yet this respect was articulated in the language of interdiction. Disenchantment shifts the referent of the secret from God to nature. Here, what is not known is to be forcefully brought into the realm of the known. Weber spoke of disenchantment as a belief that, in principle, one can master everything through calculation. If secrets of God were uninfringible, secrets of nature became tantalizing invitations to violate, a call to transgress. Not an ethics of respect to the unknown became the guiding principle of knowledge. Foxkeller juxtaposes, very interestingly, the relationship between God stroke nature to that between man stroke woman. A shift of focus to the secrets of nature that invite and incite penetration by knowledge is premised upon an equation between nature and woman. Here, man becomes godly. In the enchanted world, man could not reach out to the secrets that belong to God. With disenchantment, man with a capital M takes over certain attributes of God, most importantly, the limitlessness of his reach. Man had already occupied a special place in God's world, arriving on the seventh day of creation. Now the secrets belong to the womanly nature. Man who is now godly is not the reservoir of secrets. He is the opposite, the hunter for knowledge that potentially wins over the secrets. Woman in the world of objects remains the passive bearer of man's action. Foxkeller describes the moment when the secrets of life, the traditional bastion of the woman hitherto inaccessible to man, opened up to man's scientific scrutiny. Molecular biology led to the discovery of the double helical structure of the DNA molecule, the key to genetic transmission. The secret that was thus being revealed was hardly the secret of the living human. Molecules had replaced the human. The secret of human birth was reduced to the secret of molecular replication. We might remember here that in an earlier essay, Donna Haraway had already argued convincingly that sexual reproduction always takes two, and neither parent is continued in the child. The child remains, I quote, a randomly reassembled genetic package, unquote. Yet the discourse on genetic transmission stressed continuity. This focus on continuity is made possible by moving the infinite possibilities of shifts in the ever changing living body to the background. In the shift from the flesh to the molecules, Foxkeller sees the production of a condition she calls lifeless. She relates this to the invention of weapons of mass destruction in the form of the atom bomb and its successors. This, she says, is the displacement of flesh and blood reference of life itself. Generation or creation and destruction refer as if only to lifeless objects like the molecules or the targets. I quote, it is with the move away from the life itself that the enormous gap between the production of lifeless, devivified forms and the production of life destroying, devivifying forms achieves a curious kind of closure. Unquote. The meaning of the word secret shifts from secrets of God to secrets of nature to secrets of life and secrets of death. In the process, nature, woman, and a host of others to the modern scientific self are excluded. Life and death refer only to the dynamic of molecules and of impersonal targets. Yet, may not one very tentatively question this neat binary between life and molecules? Positing the question of sexism squarely in the workings of science, should one not interrogate also the naturalized notion of life that this binary presupposes? Are molecules mere artifacts? Are bombs just instruments? Haraway has been acute enough to treat men and non-men, animals and objects as material semiotic actors. And we all know, like a host of critics, Latour maybe, like, has tried to work across the subject-object binary through the notion of quasi-objects. A questioning may not always ignore or abandon what one questions. Interrogating the subject object, culture nature, man animal, and innumerable other binaries is associated with a questioning of the break between science and the sacred. Yet, interrogation may accompany association. One may be suspicious of the neat division between the act of division and that of blurring of divisions. One then is to hold on to both ends of a binary to question divisions while holding on to them. Breaks and need binaries are the prerequisites of moderns, which, as Latour argues, barely work in the modern world. Before going back, say, like to the implications of these questions in the context of scientific notions of life and molecules, one may go back to the ways in which these interrogations had been produced in the discourses around science. So, like, it's one way in which uh, like science uh, may be thought of in terms of a disenchantment, uh, which in a certain way of thinking about science, uh, uh, one uh, clearly demarcates the science from non-science, and yet in a certain way this is a forgetting of the inherent relations between science and non-science that continue to operate. So now I come to the question of, and I will end with this discussion, the question of the humanities, the sciences, and the university. Uh, so I um, read in a certain way. No, probably we don't have enough time to go into very details of this discussion, but maybe I'll try to read this from again that Derrida's a small but very interesting, very important and evocative essay, "The University Without Condition." So, sorry. So, uh, what is the point that Derrida is making here? I'll come back to the relation of the humanities and the sciences. This is a related discussion, a discussion which seems to me to be very important, and I hope to like link this discussion to the main point that I'm trying to make. So, what Derrida is trying to do here in this essay, which has been produced from a lecture that he had earlier given, uh, uh, this is about the turn of the century, 2002 probably the essay was published. The lecture was given in 99 or something like that. So what he's discussing here is mm, a certain problem, a certain aporia in thinking about the university. Uh, he talks about a certain unconditional freedom uh, within which the university uh, is seen to operate. Uh, Here, one has to be very careful because uh, one definitely knows that definitely in the real world there is no unconditional freedom within which a university operates. What Derrida is talking here, uh, the notion of unconditionality that he's talking of here is in a way which someone who reads Derrida is very familiar with, but which one has to be careful to think of uh, the way Derrida talks about words like unconditionality, about justice, gift, etc., like these line of words as uh, in their almost a sort of a pure abstraction. So Derrida's point would be we know that these do not operate in a pure world. These always operate in in a hybrid world, in a world where the pure abstract notions do not operate as such. But that doesn't mean that when one thinks of the word, when one thinks of the concept, one uh, has to leave the purity of the concept. Rather, it becomes important, it becomes crucial to hold on to the purity of the concept, knowing fully well that that purity doesn't operate. To think of this, one may think of the way, say, Derrida talks about the notion of the gift as in relation to what he calls the economy. Uh, when Derrida talks about gift and economy, he talks about the uh, notion of gift as uh, almost opposed to economy. Economy where one would want to think of the gift in terms of a giving and taking, where the gift giving would entail a certain receiving in a certain way. Maybe not as a material gift, counter gift, uh, but as something which one gains. Uh, Maybe in terms of connections, in terms of kinds and other things. And even Derrida is so careful here, he would say that to remember that one has given and to remember that one has received something is to already to work within an economy where one at least has that memory of giving or receiving. So the gift uh, per se would be something which is forgotten at the moment of the giving. So this gift is an impossible. So in that sense, in that way, one has to think of this unconditionality, the question of the unconditional, one doesn't mean by this that the university really operates within certain within such a notion of an unconditional freedom. But the point is, the idea of the university presupposes such an unconditional freedom. So the point is, when this in this ideality, the university has to be able to utter the truth, free from the bindings, an unconditional freedom to operate it has to have. But it also has to be responsible to the outside, the society, economy, politics. How is this possible? Is it possible at all? And to remember that the truth that Derrida is talking of here is not only a constitutive truth, but also a performative. So it's not only, like, again, I'm simplifying, almost like mercilessly simplifying. Like, it's not something, it's not a knowledge, a neutral fact, but also something which performs, produces a truth, produces an event in a certain way. So the first point is that the university is defined by an unconditionality. Uh, this university demands and ought to be granted in principle, besides what is called academic freedom, and unconditional freedom to question and to assert, or even going still further, the right to say publicly all that is required by research, knowledge, and thought concerning the truth. However enigmatic it may be, the reference to truth remains fundamental enough to be found, along with light, on the symbolic insanes of many universities throughout the world practically. So, on the one hand, this, uh, and on the other, the, the placing, the positing of the university in a certain topos. How to think of these two together? Uh, and very interestingly, uh, Derrida talks here also about how a certain virtualization, certain politics of the virtual displaces this topology of where the university is situated. So, uh, just think of this uh, a little in detail. Uh, a politics of the virtual in the cyberspace or cyber world, or in terms of what again Derrida calls worldwideization, which is something like but different from globalization, where one is thinking of a sort of a globalizing move, but a globalizing in terms of the world, not the abstract uh, abstract sphere of the globe, but of the very real world. So, like, he talks of the French word mondialization, which I'm not going into that here. But the point is, uh, the notion of the virtual, the notion of the cyberspace, what it does is it disturbs, displaces in a certain way the notion of worlding per se, the notion of what is to be uh, in the world. So, and that notion of what is to be in the world is also a character of the university. So, what does this virtualization do to the uh, topos of the university, and how maybe this has like tremendous possibilities probably when one thinks of this in a webinar, when one thinks of how the virtualization might displace the topos of where one works. Uh, and yet, one has to be very careful. One cannot be um, cannot be um, like too quick in making a decision of break, in making a decision that there is a very um, very uh, basic break operating here. There is a break, hmm, but there is also a certain continuity. And how can one think of that break and the continuity together? That's the challenge that one faces here. So uh, when one thinks of uh, the unconditional, which is there in the university, uh, and the humanities as a place where the condition of unconditionality presents itself. Uh, why humanities? Uh, that's a different question. But for now, let us take that into account, and uh, we will go into that just a little later, just now. So, to think of the humanities as a privileged place of presentation of this unconditionality, uh, and to think of how this may come at the cost of a certain ineffectivity, a certain loss of effectivity. Because to have an unconditional access to truth is in some ways to lose the connections which would constrict, condition that access. But that would imply a certain ineffectivity in its relations to the world. So the question then becomes is how to retain and produce the effect while being unconditional, while presenting, while being presented with the unconditional. Is it possible at all? Uh, one has to remember here that again, in real terms, what one calls unconditional here is not restricted to the humanities, is not restricted to the university. It may operate beyond the humanities, beyond the university. It operates beyond the humanities, beyond the university. But it's a privileged position of presentation which the humanities and the university provides to the unconditional. As opposed to that, what one may think of the scientific here, very careful. Like it doesn't mean that science works like this always. But here, the notion of the humanities and the notion of the scientific in the sense of a scientism, in the sense of a scientism where uh, science seems to rule, science seems to uh, posit itself as the reigning form of knowledge, as the best form of knowledge. So to think of that science, one would then think in the freedom in terms of a sovereignty, not of the unconditionality. So, like this. I'm positing this in a very simplified, rough and ready manner. And one has to remember, I'm not really saying that these operate in fully in these ways, but a sort of a metaphorical use of the sciences, a metaphorical use of the humanities, where the humanities would be the preferred place of the unconditional, and the sciences would be the preferred place of the sovereign, both working for a certain freedom. But freedom, whether freedom in terms of the unconditional or freedom in terms of the sovereignty. Sovereignty, which would indicate uh, notions of fixity, notions of a clear definition, notions of a clear link to the power. I cannot go into the details here. I'm just laying out the outlines. So, if we now come back to the Sokal affair, what happens there is the experience of freedom is thought of in terms of a sovereignty, in terms of a surety, in terms of a projection from the present, not in terms of the unconditional, not in terms of what Derrida calls the experience of the perhaps, not in terms of an unanticipatability. So this involves, I would aim there, this involves what I would say a mode of addressing the other, whether one tries to address the other or whether one tries to engulf the other in a sort of non response. Therein lies the relation and the non relation of the humanities and the sciences. So, just to go back to that notion of the as if and the perhaps which with which I began. So, as if is also not surety totally, but as if means one is defining very clearly as if what, giving away the notion of the perhaps, which retains the unanticipatability of the humanities. So, in a way, when one deals with the humanities, when one deals with uh, the working of the humanities in terms of the as if, in terms of sureties, projections from the present, one really is going away from the uh, uh, from the call of the humanities. One might say. So I'll aim there. Thank you.
Thank you, Anirban. Thanks a lot. It was a wonderful presentation, and there can be many questions. I will try to engage in a conversation with you and ask certain questions which, of course, have come in your discussion, but then it can be unfolded through the questions even more. One is uh, the question of science. One thing is like science is appropriated in a certain way in scientism, but science is also as a discourse appropriated by the social and political discourse. The social and political idiom, they also appropriate quote unquote science uh, in a particular way. Sorry, my cam was off. uh, the social and uh, political discourse also appropriate science in a particular way. For example, Marxism, the discourse of Marxism also uh, appropriate science in a certain particular way. It also talks about disenchantment and it claims to be scientific. We all know that the discourse of Marxism claims itself to be scientific. On one hand, it is like that. On the other hand, within, we often forget the discourse of, or the idea of, incalculable even within the discourse of science. For example, I give a concrete example. I was reading Derrida's introduction to Husserl's Origins of Geometry, and there uh, Derrida clearly says that he has taken the word undecidable from Kurt Gödel. We know about Kurt Gödel's undecidability theory, but Derrida claims it to be, we quote and we refer undecidability again and again. But we often tend to forget that Derrida himself claims to take it in certain ways and appropriate. Of course, he develops on it. It is definitely a performative concept now. It is not fixed as it has been defined by Gödel. But we often forget that within the discourse of science, it is very much there. So, uh, on one hand, science appropriated by the discourse of science in a certain way in social and political discourse. On the other hand, the idea of incalculable within the science is often forgotten when humanities people are discussing about science. So, how would you address that? That is my first question. Please, I think we can ask the other questions later.
Uh, shall I respond to this first? Uh, shall I respond to this first, and then go into the other questions?
Yes, yes,
Or
Anirban, please.
fine. See, definitely, this is very important, uh, and this, the way I have like laid out my points today. Uh, in those terms, I think here uh, this would be to be aware that the way I was talking about that when one thinks of uh, this notion of the unconditional or similar dynamic acting in the humanities, uh, one has to remember that it doesn't only act in the humanities in very real terms. Here, one is talking about is a certain uh, is is a certain notion of the humanities uh, which is operative uh, in our thinking about the relations between the sciences and the humanities. So, one has to be very clear. It's not that the humanities disciplines which are there are empirically they work according to this principle, or the disciplines of science they empirically work according to the principles of what we have called sovereignty. But the humanities as a preferred position through which this may work, through which the unconditional may present itself, and the sciences as a topos through which the sovereignty presents itself. So, this is like two sort of abstracted notions about which we are talking of here, but those abstractions occur in very real relationships to the empirical. So the moments of the empirical which go on to produce the generality called humanities, the moments of the empirical which go on to produce the generality called the sciences. Uh, there, these may happen, these may occur, and these definitely not only may, but these occur simultaneously. the unconditionality and sovereignty, and unanticipatability, and sort of fixity of teleology, they occur simultaneously. But here we are thinking of in terms of certain principles which again are linked to the moments. So these are in terms of generalities that we were trying to think of, uh, which have their own singularities. One may very importantly say. So that would be my very initial response to this. That this doesn't mean that empirically they operate in these ways.
Thank you, Anirbanda. I read one question from the chat box. A question by Professor Anindo Sengupta. He has asked a question: what role might imagination play in the aspired unconditionality of the humanities, or is it only an object of study? How might it be different from the speculative, or does it need to be different? So the question is also there on your screen. You can see.
Uh-huh.
Shall I repeat, or but it is okay?
No, no, it's all right. Yeah, it's very interesting.
Okay.
Uh, Again, this is a huge question, uh, because uh, like if one invokes Kant here, then imagination has a very specific uh, meaning. But the point is whether one is like constrained to be to follow Kant in so very uh, like strict ways, or whether one would want to think of imagination also in ways which are more commonplace, more more commonplace, less specialized. Mm. So, like in a certain way of thinking about imagination, where imagination might be, say, opposed to logic or to concreteness, concrete reality. Mm. There, definitely imagination uh, would again be a preferred space for the working of unconditionality. But one has to be very careful that imagination is not only that. That is only a kind of a commonplace, regular way of thinking about imagination. Imagination also holds within it possibilities of fixity, possibilities of being defined in terms of the scientific in certain ways. So I think I cannot really uh, respond adequately to this question just now, but only point to the necessity to think about this uh, in our context, in a much more variegated, a much more richer dynamic. So that would be my first response.
Devashish Da, Professor Banerjee, do you want to ask any question? Or even if you have anything to ask. Thank you.
Not really. I think it was a really fascinating talk, and I could see a lot of overlap and parallels, many points at which I resonated very much. And particularly your last question, Shamrat, I was also thinking about that with regard to the notion of undecidability and unknowability within science. It's one thing that we have to remember, as Anirban said about the generalities. There is a historicity to science itself, and the various moments that make up that historicity fall into the contest of the will for power, which is operating. It doesn't belong to a certain point in time. It coexists. All the moments coexist in this moment as points of power, so to say, so that the creation of this discourse of truth as a sovereign discourse is something that generalizes over that particular area, while the notion of undecidability or unknowability becomes an esoteric truth within it, and not even available to the way in which the will to power presents it to the general public, so to say. That kind of notion occurred to me while Anirban was talking about the space or the topos of humanities and sciences in the university.
Thank you,
Thank you, Devashish, for
Devashishda.
bringing this up. Definitely. Yeah. No, bolo, bolo.
Very, very interesting comment. Uh, but just to conclude with one last question, it's extending a lot, but then that is about virtualization. This is a question to Anirbanda, but Devashishda, if you like, you can also respond that, we are talking about virtualization, the virtual world as a specific historical political moment, but this virtualization of knowledge, which also implies a certain decontextualization, and decontextualization can have certain possibilities because, on one hand, decontextualization is something uh, which can again recontextualize a thing, something which belongs to the other, to other spaces, might be appropriated and reinterpreted. But the problem which Anirbanda talked about, a virtualization, is also throwing the situation, the the location of the university away, the topology of the university away, and it creates a certain crisis of knowledge. But I was just thinking, if this historical moment of virtualization also has its uh, genealogical precedents, like, think of colonialism, the way we have appropriated liberal humanist knowledge, and it is very important in case of the idea of scientific reason also in our context, totally decontextualizing it by through a certain modality of power. Through colonialism, we have absorbed and appropriated the liberal humanist knowledge without contextualizing it to the Europe, and we have universalized it in our context. So, are we seeing a new manifestation of that in virtualization, that we are discussing critical theory, we are thinking of Western liberalism, and we are doing it virtually, and it is, I don't know whether my students are connecting with it, or the other speakers in here in this place are connecting with it. So this connection also implies a certain distinction. So do you have anything to say about it, please, Anirban, then Devashish also.
See, a very important thing, very important point that you made, definitely. Uh, uh, see, uh, this question of virtualization appears here in the context of uh, uh, as I was talking about, what Derrida calls that worldwideization, and very interesting. Like, I sometimes I while talking in class, I talk about how this whole and this is well known thing, but like Derrida here also talks about how this whole notion of like uh, sort of what is commonly called globalization, that sort of producing connections around the world, uh, that has been talked very like um, very almost clairvoyantly, like in Marx and Lenin, uh, who were talking of how like the whole working of capital was leading towards a like worldwideization to and the point is how what we like called here provisionally virtualization, how that affects this whole process. This whole process where like it's not only a like making of connections but also a making of hierarchies, not only a like making of knowledge in a certain way, but also a making possible of workings of power in certain very specific ways. The working of capital, the working of colonialism, the working of the other forms of hierarchies. What the virtualization, how it displaces the workings of the relationships to the world. That is what is really very important and what one needs to study again, like in like some meticulous details. And definitely there have been studies, there have been important studies on this. But like what happens uh, at a conceptual level also, that is what becomes very important at this point. So I think this is a very important question that you raise. But again, like which we cannot address here in such a short discussion. That will need a very detailed discussion of the matters involved. And I think maybe like Devashista, if you want to say something more.
Not really. I think, yeah, I agree that yes, it is a really important issue of our time, and as you mentioned, it is a question of completely two levels. On one level of local knowledge, and the other level of a making universal that are happening simultaneously. And in that sense, there is also a politics involved. There are all kinds of inequalities, but also a politics involved, which is performative. And I think that that entire area, it's again, as you mentioned, it really requires consideration, and it requires deep consideration, I think.
Thanks both the speakers. If uh, Pavel or Mamatadi, you have some last word to say, because there are many more questions, but we cannot address all of them, and it is important that uh, to let the speakers go, because everybody has to eat and sleep, and we are holding people. Another question is there, to just a short response. Hasn't humanities deconstructed sovereign discourse of science in a mocking way? The so-called hoax like absurdity was also figured by Rabelais to mock at the scholastic tradition with methodologies. Any response? I think yes, the answer would be affirmative. Yeah, can't hear. Can't hear. Anirban, cannot hear.
Oh, sorry. Uh,
Huh.
I think that you it's a very valid point that you talk about. The point is like, hello, hello. Okay, like, am I being heard? Yeah, yeah. So, uh, but I only would want to be a little careful in using the term deconstruction, like whether to mock in a certain way and to deconstruct would be like slightly different things, slight but crucial. Uh, so, just keeping that in mind, one might say that like these other figurings of scientific mode of working, uh, those might be important in a deconstruction of the relations between science and humanities. Definitely, I agree to that. Thank you. Yeah.
So I thank Professor Anirban Das and Professor Devashish Banerjee. Pavel, would you like to say something? Pavel? Yeah, Pavel has left. I don't know. There's some technical problem. Maybe he'll join back. Mamatadi? Mamatadi, you want to say something? Switch on the mic and say. Mamatadi, you say something?
মাইকটা অন করতে হবে।
হ্যাঁ, mic on করতে হবে। Okay, there is some problem with the connection. Mamatadi, we can't hear you. Yeah. Pavel, you say something then. The last word. Then we can end the discussion.
Actually, I want to.
I want to.
Yeah. Hello.
Sharmada, can you mute your mic? Yeah. I don't have any question as of now, but I just want to thank both the speakers, and I have been enlightened in many ways by their speeches, and I hope they will come back on this platform again when we invite them again. Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Thanks Mamatadi. You were present there. You joined later also in the StreamYard. We couldn't listen to you, but definitely we'll talk later. It's unfortunate. Thank you all the speakers. So we break here. End of today's discussion. Tomorrow we have a session from 6 to 8. So if you wish to join, you can. We'll send you the YouTube link. Thank you. So goodbye to everyone. Many thanks for making it a successful.
Thank you, Shamrat. Enjoyed it.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a great session.